Good evening, Facebook and YouTube family and other streaming platforms. We at the Empowerment Platform are here tonight again, and we thank you for joining us on March 15th, 2020. And tonight I have a special guest with me, Katherine Shivers. Of course, that is my wife, and we just got off of celebrating our 11th year anniversary. So, everybody out there in the world, give us a hand. Yay! All right, a little bit of housekeeping. So, if you want to comment on Facebook, it's going to hide your name until you go to this website and follow the rules. Posting it to you now. Feel free that if you want to comment, go to that site, follow their prompts, and if you want your name to be seen, it will allow your name to be seen. Tonight, we are talking about language and translation 101 with Catherine. Oftentimes, language access and other things like that get left behind when most of us speak English, and we don't really think about the population in our country and around the world that speak different languages that still need language access, equality in language access, and even in our school systems here. So, Catherine will take us down and give us some great points about language access, the fairness about it, and even some federal laws that you may not be aware of dealing with that. So, without further ado, Catherine, welcome. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Great. So let's start with a little bit of your background from growing up. What Tell us about how you grew up, your language that you used in the household, and what really got you down to wanting to start a translation company.
Well, I grew up in the Bronx in New York. My parents are Spanish speaking, and they are originally from the Dominican Republic. And I grew up in a city where a good percentage of the population is Hispanic and foreign born. So growing up in school, going to parent teacher conferences and just growing up in the school system. Usually my mom would go with me to the parent teacher conferences and the like I said, just being in a city where there was such a big foreign population, the teachers, sometimes they would know 1 or 2 words, in different languages, and especially in Spanish, just because the population of Spanish speakers was so large. So I would often go with my mother to the parent-teacher conferences. I would interpret for her, and a lot of the times it put me in an awkward situation because, um and, growing up, I was a good student and everything like that, but if there was one little thing that I might have not been, so confident about, say, for example, if I was struggling with a specific subject, I would have to interpret that to my parents, and that's nothing to be ashamed about, but, oftentimes students with parents who don't speak English do see themselves in that situation. Um, so I was lucky enough to have a good amount of teachers that would kind of recognize, oh, maybe you left this out, or maybe you didn't cover this specific sentence that I am trying to communicate to your mother. Um, so that did help, but it would have been great for my parents to be able to directly communicate with the teacher. So that really gave me a passion for just translation in general. And even outside of school, I would often go with my mother to different appointments or, just things around the community that I would need to translate for. And oftentimes I did not have the vocab to really transmit what they were saying, so you kind of have to finagle or, or even rely on the fact that my mother being in New York for a few years before I was born, that sometimes, luckily, she would pick up on a word or two and kind of be able to fill in that blank. Um, but really, that just gave me the passion to really just say, "Hey, this should not be the way that students grow up having to interpret for their parents," and really just bring the parents and the teachers together to be able to support students in the classroom.
Okay.
Mhm,
So a lot of times, and we see it when you go to meetings and events at schools, and just for the audience, we focus at Strata Lang, which is the company name, Strata Language Services LLC, on the education market primarily. You're probably more familiar with court interpreters or medical translators or any of the larger scale, or you've maybe seen some marketing where you saw a company or business put something out in Spanish. But we focus solely on the education market. And what we see oftentimes, even in our local schools here in Maryland, sometimes they'll send paperwork home, sometimes it's translated into another language, and sometimes it's not. So there still is a gap between what Catherine was saying, where parents may have to have information translated to them, and then they're relying on their kids who are elementary students and middle school up to high school who may not have all the words necessary to get that information over to their parents, or if it's a conference type situation, they may omit or
mhm.
leave out certain things because they don't want to give the whole story, especially when it's a negative consequence. Um, Before we dive deeper into that, tell a little bit about your military background, your language training, and your schooling. What makes you a um, certified or an expert in translation?
So after, graduating high school, I, went to college, and from there, I joined the Air Force, and I was in the Air Force for 6 years as a linguist. First, I started off being a Korean linguist, and then I switched over to being a Spanish linguist. Um, then after that, I got my BA in international relations with a concentration in Latin American studies. And after that, I did some work in with the DoD as a translator, and it really gave me a passion for wanting to do this locally.
Mhm.
Um, I did work with the local school system as a parent-teacher conference interpreter, and I just found that a lot of the times parents were just so grateful just to have someone to be able to communicate to them what was going on with their students' education, be it good or bad.
Mhm.
Um, and after that, I got my master's in Spanish translation and interpreting from the University of Texas. And in 2018, I started Strata Language Services.
Okay. So the now that we know that you're an expert in this, we know the reasons why you chose to do this, the passion behind it, the equal access. Let's talk a little bit about why it's needed, and that's kind of where our translation one-on-one topic comes in. Oftentimes, and even for one of our clients, we have a client that they translate materials coming in bound to them from prison systems.
Mhm,
And when we first met them, there was not a system around that. They would go find somebody taking a Spanish class to translate it, or they would try to loosely get somebody from a university or anyone they could find, and the state said, "This is not right. You need a professional to translate it." So let's talk a little bit about why you need a professional, why having a kid translate is not a good thing, why things like auto translators, such as some of our big search engine translators, why we can't rely on them 100% for r- really just translating and interpreting on a consistent basis. Why do we need a professional? Because for me, I would probably have thought in the past that, hey, I need this in Spanish. Let me go plug it in and let me see what the auto translator would give me back. So let's just talk a little bit about why a translator is needed.
Right. So the importance of translation, it's not just something that's nice to have for you to be able to communicate with people who speak other languages. It can actually be related to the Civil Rights Act and the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the successor to the No Child Left Behind Act. And r- along with the Civil Rights Act, it deals with equal access for people who may come from a different background, may speak another language within the United States. So the importance specifically in translation is that, for example, let's say you have a student whose parents don't speak English or have a limited English proficiency. So the student starts going to class, and let's say they struggle in a specific subject, and the teacher wants to call a parent teacher conference. Now, the parent wants to be involved in their child's education, and study after study shows the importance of parental involvement in their child's education. Um, so the parent goes to the conference, and the teacher is talking to the parent, but the parent does not really understand what's going
Mm,
on because of their limited English proficiency. That's where an interpreter comes in, and they're a neutral party to the conversation. So the interpreter comes in, transmits the message back and forth between the teacher and the parent, and that way you can still have that partnership that's needed in education for the student to succeed, and you're not putting the student in the situation where they might, um, feel embarrassed or not so proud of their grades, or maybe it's a disciplinary issue. Um, so you're not really putting the student in that situation, and you're not changing the power dynamics, because when you have a student who's responsible for transmitting a the communication to the parent, they have the power to omit things, to change things. And it's not that we're saying that they don't have the integrity, but kids are going to be kids. And you know, a lot of the times you might not want to tell your parent, "Oh, I got a bad grade in this
mm,
because I didn't do my homework," or it could be a number of things. Or it can even be something positive, such as the student wants to recommend I'm sorry, the teacher wants to recommend the student for AP classes or advanced placement classes, or they want the student to take this extracurricular activity that might help them get college credits. There's a number of things where an interpreter can come in and transmit that information to the parent, so that, like I said, the parent and the teacher can be a team and continue to help that student through their education.
right. And the interpreter that's at the conference, that person is, like you said, a neutral party.
Right.
They take one message, translate it, pass it to the other person, and then back. They're not there to add in anything that they think.
Mhm.
It's a straight translation of what's being said. It's not this person's emotions that's involved.
right.
It's not them trying to say it the way they think it should be said. It's a strict translation. So when you have a professional interpreter there at a conference, whether it be education or medical or legal, that person's giving the message straight.
Right, absolutely, and like you said, a professional interpreter or translator is responsible for getting that initial message across and not leaving anything out, and just taking into consideration, the background of the family. There's a lot of things, a lot of research involved before the interpreter actually goes to an interpreting appointment. They research the vocabulary, they research the subject, for example, if I were to go to a conference with a math teacher, I would research different math terminology. And I know even as parents, sometimes, myself being a parent, we struggle with math terminology or different subjects just in English. So you can imagine a parent who doesn't speak English, what that communication breakdown would be like. Um, So, it's definitely important to have an interpreter there just to make sure that that communication is strong.
Got it. So we talked a lot about the actual interpreter. Now let's go dig a little bit into the document side of it. So
Mhm.
there's a difference between translation and interpreting. Translating is the word on paper, the document. And so when, for instance, let's just take a report card comes home or another important letter in English comes home. Why can't that other language speaker just have that document put into a auto translator online and have it spit out what it means in their home language. So why can't the kid take it and type it in there? And because I saw an Excel sheet that if you put all the words in it, it'll take it straight to the website, and then it'll come back out and it'll be translated. Why is that not the best route to take?
So, admittedly, machine translation has improved over the years, and just like with any other type of technology, there's so many advances and so many improvements every day. Uh, but document translation and interpreting, it takes a human set of eyes and it takes a human touch to really make sure that you're considering the tone and register that you're using, making sure that you're not being too formal for your audience or too informal for certain audiences. So just a a plug and play, basically, a translation is not the best solution because you don't want to have a translation that's good enough. If there's that one key piece of information, there's that one key term that would make the difference for a parent to understand what this report card means, for example, what specific skill the student might be struggling with, what specific subjects or that they can get their student help with. It would make all the difference, really. Just recently, I saw a breakdown of the statewide assessments, and
Mhm.
they break it down by skill.
Right.
Um, so, it's not so much now just, oh, the student understands how to read and understands how to answer these questions. There's specific skills that report cards outline and state assessments outline, which those are important to get translated as well. So you don't just want to plug in something like that into a machine translation and risk the possibility of not really getting the point across.
And I think that it's just like here in the States, we have different dialects. You
Right.
you being born and raised in the Bronx in New York, and me being from Alabama, when we came together, the language that we talk in English is different.
Right,
for
absolutely.
one another. So there are those same cultural differences between all Spanish speaking people don't speak the same Spanish.
Right, and as an example, a word as simple as ahorita in the Dominican Republic, and I'm sure in other countries, that could mean later. But in places like Mexico and in other countries, that could mean right now.
Okay.
So even something as simple as that can really make a difference because, for example, if you're telling someone to do something ahorita, do you want them to do it later or do you want them to do it right now? So just little nuances like that with, like you said, regional dialects, different countries have different words for things. And if you're not careful, you could end up offending someone by just using one word.
Mm. And that kinda goes into what you were talking about, the formal and the informal,
Mhm.
terms, because when we say "you," we just say "you," but it's not the same way in Spanish.
Right. In Spanish, there's the tú and then there's usted. The tú is more familiar. You know the person. The person might be younger than you. Um, and the usted is more formal. You could be speaking to an elder, or you could just be trying to keep the conversation formal, or as a sign of respect. So even with just that difference in using tú or usted and the different verb conjugations that come along with that,
Mhm.
you could be taking your conversation to in a whole nother path.
Wow. So that definitely opens up a lot because you can just be typing it in, and oftentimes we usually write and type the way we speak,
Mhm.
so it's not formal anyway. So I
Right,
can just be typing into the machine translator the way I'm speaking and the way I think,
right.
and the translation will be totally different than what it's supposed to be for that audience because I'm actually tailoring it to myself.
Right. I think I think I lost you.
Oh, you're
Okay.
back.
Definitely, and along those lines, even the difference between capitalization between English and Spanish, where you place a comma, where you place the adjective, all those things come into play when you're translating a document, the written word, from one language to another. So that's really important to keep in mind because the comma can separate two different thoughts or it just makes a difference, just knowing the grammar rules in your target language, which for me it's Spanish.
Okay.
Mm.
So do you have any other examples of things that I guess we could call them translations gone wrong by using a straight machine translation and then having somebody review it?
So for example, I inputting into a well-known translation machine translator, paper jam, right? When your printer is jammed, we call it a paper jam.
Mhm.
So I input that into an automated translator and it gave me mermelada de papel, which is literally jam for paper, I guess you would say. Um, so like jelly or jam.
Okay.
So that's just one example. It's just depending on the situation. You could plug something in and you would really just be if you don't know the language, of course, you would kinda just be oblivious to the fact that that does not sound right to a Spanish speaker, and you would give someone the document, and they would look at it like, this does not make sense, so
Right, because I know when I was trying to get some stuff done construction-wise and the guys that all they spoke was Spanish and didn't speak English, I was trying to put some things in, and then when I looked at it, I knew that it didn't come out the way I was thinking, so I had sent it
right,
to your brother, And I was like, "Hey, can you take a look at this and tell me if it's right?" He was like, "Dude, no, that ain't it." And
Right.
he for me, and then I was able to send it. But had I not even thought about it, or if I didn't recognize it, I would just sent this out, and the guy probably would have looked at it like, "What are you trying to say to me?"
Right, absolutely. And when you dive deeper into things such as IEPs and just student and parental rights in the education field, that can really cause problems because you might not be transmitting the right message just by using machine translation. And that student and that parent or guardian, they could really be missing out on critical resources. And yeah, so that's
So when we think about and we look at all the varieties of translating and interpreting, and we just want to make sure that our audience knows that if you need professional translation, you need to find somebody that's certified, somebody that's been trained, and there's all types of different ways. Like you went through at first in the military, you were trained there in their school that does just language training, teaches you a whole new language, and you do regular tests to make sure that you have your levels are correct before you could be what they call, I guess, ready or proficient.
right.
And then you have bodies like the American Translator Association,
Mhm.
and they will credential you. You take a test, you get certified, and then you have to do the continual education units. So when you're dealing with a translator out there, um, family, you got to make sure you find people that have been doing it and they're not just your cousin down the street.
Absolutely.
Especially, and you can't even do that, and I think education is the market that's still kinda lagging behind, because if you go to court, you gotta have a court certified interpreter.
Right.
If you go to the doctor's office and they bring somebody, they're gonna be a medically certified translator. You're not just gonna be able to get anyone to come do it because of the seriousness behind translating and conveying the right information. So, we like to work in the education market because 1, Catherine has a passion there, and 2, they're still catching up.
Right.
They like to have translating sometimes. Sometimes we'll send the documents home. Some events I have the interpreters there. And Spanish is one of the larger ones in our country, but there are other languages that aren't represented well.
Right.
Uh, and those people need equal access because to have whole people, we need the same access across the board for everybody.
And I think that's why it's important for school districts to really have a handle on who is in their school district, what languages they speak, using those surveys, using those home language surveys, and really taking a holistic look at their population and just knowing, okay, how can we have better partnership with the parents by providing that language access? And that just goes back to what I mentioned about the different acts and the ESSA. And really, there have been a lot of surveys that have come out about parental involvement in the education field. And they show that parental involvement in things, activities such as PTA meetings, volunteering in schools, just visits to the guidance counselor, they drop significantly when you don't have an English speaking parent or guardian in the household. So the percentages are less when there is one English speaking parent in the household. And when there are no speaking, Eng I'm sorry, English speaking parents in the household, that number drops even lower. So that just highlights the importance of getting those materials translated
Mm.
to have those parents engaging in things like PTA meetings and going to those parent teacher conferences and keeping up with their children's grades and just be really being able to be that partner with that teacher.
And I think we saw a major difference when we moved counties, because when you was working in Howard County, they
Mhm.
had Hispanic liaisons,
Right.
and you served in that role, and you were there at the school every day, being able to make those phone calls to the parents of the students that needed that extra help. You were able to be available for the conferences. They
Mhm.
had you there on a daily basis, versus now what we see is a kind of hit and miss, or if you're lucky, you might get a piece of paper and you'll know.
Right.
But I think that is what the model should be. If you agree, at different schools should have someone in charge of that.
Right, absolutely, and, it's not just for parent-teacher conferences. There's so many aspects to school. There are these, um the meetings that take place, such as, like, different little events that the children participate in, and just having parents there and just having the parents know what those events are and being there, and one of those ways is getting that material translated and sent home. That is so important to children. For example, if they have a talent show or a science fair project that is coming up, it is so important to have that parent involved. And if a parent with limited or no English proficiency gets a flyer home in English and it's just a bunch of words to them, they're going to be relying on the student
Yeah.
to communicate that with them, and that doesn't always happen. Um, so it's just really important to have the parent be also in charge of their students' education. A lot of the times, parents with little or no English proficiency, um, because they don't have that language access, they just figure, okay, well, the teachers are the experts.
Mm.
They are in charge of the child's education, and they, they kind of get lost as the years go by, especially towards middle school and high school. Things get more and more complicated. The schoolwork gets more complicated. So there's really that disconnect with the child's education. So that's really why that language access is so important.
And not to mention the homework, we're talking about student handbooks,
Right.
manuals, rules, things that if you don't get, for instance, when we went to the school, they asked us were we using this online system for grades. And we kind of was like, "Oh, we didn't really know that you guys were actually using that, so we weren't using it." I can't imagine if you don't speak the language, then what? Then you don't know that the tool, 1, exists, and if it's a website that you have to go to and it's not in the target language, then what do you do?
Right, at that point, you're relying on a student who could be as young as 5, it could be a
Mhm.
kindergartner, to show you how to navigate a website that's completely in English. A lot of the times, like you mentioned, they the school districts use different platforms to track grades and what classes the children are enrolled in. And if the parents don't have access to that, they're really relying on the children to give them that information.
Oh, wow. And if anyone out there is wondering what can you do in that case for a website, there is localization
Mhm.
website localization that translators where they will take a website, they look at the code on the back and all the English in it, and then they will translate that into the target language, and then you can reproduce it, and it'll come up in their language. Oftentimes, websites have to be designed to go from one language to the next. They don't do it automatically. So if you go to a website and it has a different language capability, somebody did that on the back end. It's just not available across the board everywhere.
Right, absolutely, and I also have seen, there is a plugin where, some companies or school districts, they'll use that plugin to automatically translate their website. It won't necessarily be localized by a translator, and a lot of the times, there are a lot of misses, uh,
Mhm.
on those terms and um, those phrases. So really having that website localized and translated is definitely key to maintaining that connection.
Yeah, and one of our clients that we've been working with, since we kinda launched the company, they actually do plans for educators, and with those plans, they create best practices, how educators can reach students, different techniques, I guess personal or yeah, development for teachers. They work on that angle, and they send us those documents to be translated, and then it goes out to their market, whatever states they're in. And there are different states that have a greater need for Spanish translated materials or other language translated materials, and we're able to be that help to them and assist them with getting it out there. So we're not the content creators in sense, we're just translating what's been created, and then they are able to pass it down to their client who then utilizes it.
Right, and along those lines, we've seen in different studies where there are a number of states that have seen an uptick in their Spanish-speaking population. And that's really something to take into account for especially for in the education market for school districts to really keep an eye on that and make sure that they're providing that language access, making sure they're not, leaving students in the dark that do need that language access and for their parents as well, so they can maintain that involvement. A lot of the times the translation is not only for parents. The translation could be for students who might have recently arrived in the country or, for example, a kindergartner who, as in my example, who grew up speaking Spanish in the home, but when you go to public school, it's in English, of course.
Mhm.
So you really need to provide that language access while they get adjusted to the, uh, the English in the public school system. So a lot of the times it's not just the information for the parents.
And I can think about in New York, with it being so diverse, so multicultural, so many different languages and communities there, when you went to school speaking primarily Spanish, you probably had a teacher or someone that was able to guide you from Spanish to English. A lot in other areas or states that don't have such Alabama, for one, I could probably tell you still to this day, if there was a family that left and they had a young child go to any of the schools in where I grew up, I can't even think of how they would get them language access. Like, I don't even know if there are even resources there to do that. So, with that being said, this you don't have to have a person necessarily in your location. A lot of this can be done with technology.
Right, absolutely. And like you mentioned, we work with one of our clients who they provide documents for a variety of states and states that historically have not had such a high Hispanic population, but they're seeing that uptick and they recognize the need to get those documents translated. So it's just really important to keep track of that. For example, in 2016, I recently put out a post that states that in 2016, within the United States, 9.6% of students were English language learners. So that's almost 10% of students
Mhm.
4 years ago. And in 2025, that's expected to grow to 25% of the public. school students are going to be English language learners. So you can imagine if we don't provide that language access to those students and those families at home, what what gap in their education is going to exist? What are they going to be missing? What opportunities, what extracurricular activities are they going to be missing out on simply because there's not an investment in language access? So we can really provide that. We don't, especially with technology, we don't even have to be in the same state. You can send us your documents, we can translate them and send them back, and you're complying with different laws and regulations on equal language access.
And that goes also to teleconferences, web conferences. There are a lot of different avenues now that can be taken where you don't necessarily, if you say that your school system or you reach out to your school system and they say something like, well, we don't have a language person in the budget, we don't have anybody at the school, they can find ways to virtually do this thing. And it could be just a straight Zoom conference between a teacher, a parent, and a translator. Or if they need to bring the teacher and the parent in one room and let them Zoom out from the school, that's
Right.
an option. Because actually, we got a call about it was a college. Where was that college? In Virginia, I believe. There, I think they were doing a Spanish course or
Right.
yeah, they were doing a Spanish course, and they needed a part of that coursework was to talk to native language
Mhm.
Spanish language speakers, and I think it was where was it? I can't remember now.
The country,
Yeah, it was one of
Colombia.
Colombia, and they asked us, did we provide that kind of service? Will we provide native speakers to be able to communicate with their speakers here, English speakers learning Spanish down there. So a lot of colleges and universities are also reaching out to companies like ours and other companies to see who can facilitate that kind of work and lesson planning. So, and it's all being done virtually and over the phone. You have your companies, larger companies that have their 1-800 numbers and call centers where you can actually pick up the phone,
Mhm.
somebody will answer, you tell them a language, and then it connects to somebody that speaks that language, and there's just really no reason why everyone in our country can't have equal language access. We just have to be more serious about making sure that we communicate that it is available.
Right, absolutely. And just to go back to your point about language access not being in the budget, um, you really, for school districts and for schools, you really need to take a hard look at the priorities for language access because you want to invest in things when you see the need
Mhm.
or you have to actually look for the need. You don't want to get down the line and realize that you're being sued or that a student is failing their class because you haven't been communicating with the student or the parent in a language that they understand. So you really should not really make it about your budget. And like you mentioned, there are so many resources, telephonic interpretation, video interpreting. There are so many solutions to the language access issue that um, the budget should not restrict you.
Right. And different school districts take on a different, I guess, role based on their community, and if they have their hand on the pulse of the situation, they can understand, like you said, when there's a quarter, 1 out of 4 that will be an English learner, that's a huge number in students. That 1 out of every 4 will need some type of IEP, which is a or EIP, education improvement plan, to and add English as their second language.
Right, absolutely, and, along with IEP plans, that for those of you not familiar with IEP plans, they're a plan, um, that deals specifically with certain disabilities or accommodations. It could be anything from needing extra time on a test to, needing to be in smaller class settings with a lower student to teacher ratio. It could be that the student has dyslexia. There are so many things that go into IEPs that not having those plans translated and not having an interpreter in those IEP meetings, it's
Mhm.
really a disservice and it's actually against a lot of the rights for the students. So, that's also another thing that, districts and schools need to look at.
Okay. What for as we wrap up on our hour, what are some things that you think, especially what takeaways should the audience take today? Um, what do you think are some of the most important ideas? And well, we have a comment here. Show it to you. As for someone who works in education and in the school system, it's a legal binding contract that has to be followed to follow the plan. So you wanna make sure, like Catherine said, that you don't overstep somebody's rights just because you put a plan together and then it's not in their language.
Right, absolutely, and, as was mentioned, when you're signing a contract, you have to understand what you're signing. And
Mhm.
you have to really know what your rights are, what your responsibilities are, what's going to take place, what the plan is, what accommodations are going to be offered to the student. So, yes, it is a contract that the parent has to sign, the teacher has to sign, and there are multiple parties that are at that IEP meeting, and you definitely do not want to have language be a barrier in that setting.
And there's another thing outside of the education, when I have been to, rent court for tenants, if that lease is in all English and they don't speak English, a lot of times the judge will void those leases, especially if that person says that they really didn't know what they were signing, because you have to if you know they don't speak the language, you have to provide them the information in a language that they can understand because it's a legally binding contract. So as we wrap it up, what are some key takeaways that you have for the audience? Your number 1 or 2 things that they should know in regards to language translation and interpreting and equal language access.
Well, the first thing is just the importance of having someone who is a third party to the conversation, who's not in any way emotionally attached, who has taken the time to research the vocabulary, research the subject, and is really there to convey the message between, for example, education market, between the parent and the teacher. So that's the the major thing. And secondly, I would say that the school districts, we really need to keep an eye on not just student performance. I know with state assessments and, these different requirements that come out every year, it seems like things are changing. Things are um, there are more requirements being put on teachers and principals. We really need to take a look and make sure that we're incorporating language into that so that those students and those parents are actually understanding what's going on with those changes with, okay, what am I supposed to be making sure that my student understands? What skills is my student supposed to have at this age? Um, So really those 2 things are important, just that parental involvement and making sure that students succeed, part of which is having the parents directly communicating with the teacher by using or a translator or an interpreter and just getting that information back and forth.
Okay. And I guess my takeaway from all of this is, and on a much lighter side, is don't get your mama's auntie cousin to translate your documents. You just
Right.
there's so much that goes on, and even translators, if they make mistakes, we've seen articles and news where a translator messed up in a medical because you told me about a article, some medical translator messed up and translated the wrong thing.
Yes, and, the patient, it was a medical situation, and the patient was, um he was treated for the wrong thing because they had a family member interpreting for them, and he was treated for a whole 'nother, affliction, and he actually ended up with, some damages. I think he ended up, I wanna say quadriplegic, if I'm remembering right. So especially it's especially important to have a professional translator, just even if you just wanna have somebody look over a machine translation, that's another option too. It's so important to just have that human set of eyes and just to make sure that you're not making a costly mistake because in that situation, if the hospital system would have invested upfront in an interpreter or a translator, they would have saved themselves so much money and the family so much heartache if they would have invested upfront in having an interpreter there.
Right, because they ended up being sued
Right.
by not providing that, that translator out to the family and allowing them to have someone else, translate, and it was just the wrong information. So you wanna make sure my takeaways are that is very, very serious, in different aspects of life, education, legal, medical, immigration, you need that certified translator, someone with years of experience that has just they're able to do this for you. And like Catherine said, even if it's just proofreading, because we offer proofreading and checking, and it's not a full translation. You already have it translated. You send it to us, and we proofread that with your original to make sure that hey, it's what you think it conveys. And I think most people jokingly talk about translation when they get a Chinese tattoo and they're like, "Oh, does it really say what it's supposed to say?" No, other than that, you really need to look out for people that you work with. Um, make sure that everybody just has that equal access to language. It's a right. It's something that we at the empowerment platform will continue to push because our whole thing is that we want everybody to be empowered to reach their goals. And this is a whole nother layer to that because there are a lot of people that we know personally that are not able to get what they need because of a language barrier. And it's not that far out of reach. I volunteer in schools and I see kids that they're speaking Spanish in their own little group and
Mhm.
they're kinda outside of the other group. So you gotta make sure that they are incorporated, that the school system as a matter of fact, when I went and volunteered at and did that speech, there were kids there that I talked to that I know speak Spanish, but there was nobody to translate what I was saying. Materials that handed out, they weren't in Spanish, so if those kids had any trouble with the English language, then nothing would have been provided for them, so I that just hit, and I just thought about that, and that's a thing that I will make sure I bring up to them that, "Hey, you might wanna take another look at this."
Absolutely. It's just so important to keep the students engaged, and a lot of people might turn it into a a topic of immigration or things like that, but it's really just about equal access and keeping those students and those families engaged in that education and just ensuring equal access.
So, as we wind it up, we want to just thank you, Catherine, for joining us.
And thank you.
At the Empowerment Platform, our goal is to empower you to reach your goals, whatever they are, and to provide tools, resources, things that you need in order to get there. That is our sole focus on the Empowerment Platform. If you are listening and you are an educator, if you are someone who volunteers, works, or provides educational materials, and you need something translated, or you just want to take your business or what you do as an educator or teacher, and you want to be able to provide resources in the target language, Spanish to English, English to Spanish, you're welcome to reach out to us. I put our website in the chat a little bit earlier. There it is again. And you can go on our website, email us at info@strataland.com, and we'll be more than happy to work with you and get those documents translated and even do over the phone interpretation as needed, video conferencing as needed, if those are needs for you. And if you have a language outside of Spanish that we don't focus on, we are able to connect you with our partners in the community that do that work. So I thank you guys. Thank you, Catherine, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
It was a blast. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to drop a chat in the Facebook or just reach out to us. And we are signing off, and we will see you next week.